Hey everyone, my name is Daniil Gataulin. I'm one of senior research analysts covering biotech here at Chardan, where our vision is to help identify companies with high potential for investment returns based on creating real value for society through disruptive innovation. It is my pleasure to introduce Steve Pakola to our virtual ophthalmology summit, where the initial focus is on wet AMD and diabetes-related ocular diseases. Steve, welcome.
Hi, Daniil. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. To start things off, can you please provide a brief overview of REGENXBIO?
Sure. REGENXBIO, we are a late-stage drug development company founded almost 15 years ago, and our goal is to improve lives through the curative potential of our NAV platform of AAV vectors. And over time, we've become leaders in the gene therapy space. And this is largely based on our end-to-end capabilities in developing AAV therapies. And actually, the first ever systemic in vivo gene therapy utilizes our NAV technology, and that is Zolgensma for the treatment of spinal muscular atrophy. And now we're extending on such prior successes with our 5x25 plan to have 5 programs of ours or our licensees in pivotal stage or commercial product by 2025. So excited to be here and talk to you about our programs.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And I know your pipeline is quite broad, but since this is an ophthalmology-focused summit, we'll limit our discussions to that. So let's jump right into the 314 programs. Can you touch on what those programs are, where they are in clinical development, and maybe you can comment on the delivery methods as well that you're developing for those programs.
Yeah, our most advanced platform is our ophthalmology platform, and specifically retina, with our 314 program, which we're developing with our global partner AbbVie. And we signed that deal a little over 18 months ago, and that's really been super helpful in advancing the global reach of 314, which we can get into. So as some background, 314 utilizes our AAV8 vector and encodes for an anti-VEGF antibody fragment. And the goal is sustained protein production by the patient's own retinal cells. And we in AbbVie are developing 314 with the intent to be the first ever one-time treatment of major retinal diseases such as wet AMD and diabetic retinopathy. You mentioned routes of administration. We're looking at 2 different routes. The first is the most clinically validated approach for retinal gene therapy, and that's subretinal delivery. And we're also looking at in-office suprachoroidal delivery. So to start with our most advanced program, subretinal delivery for treatment of wet AMD, where we're in with our global partner, pivotal development with 2 ongoing phase 3 studies, Atmosphere and Ascent. And these are the largest ever gene therapy programs ever run. So we in AbbVie actually earlier this year took the program global with addition of Europe, Israel, and Japan. So this is a nice example of why we did enter into this global collaboration with AbbVie to increase that global reach. Switching to suprachoroidal, we have 2 ongoing phase 2 studies assessing treatment of wet AMD in our AAV8 study and diabetic retinopathy in our Altitude study. And these are the first ever suprachoroidal delivery of gene therapy studies. So a lot of opportunity here to really lead in gene therapy space for treatment of serious retinal diseases.
Got it. Thanks for that overview. The market for wet AMD is evolving pretty quickly. So I wanted to hear your take on the opportunity for 314 and why you believe it is the right approach to treat wet AMD and diabetic retinopathy, especially in light of the newer products with extended dosing intervals?
Sure, this is a very exciting time in retina, a very innovative space to begin with. As you mentioned, and you're certainly well aware of the evolution of drug development in this space. And I think it's fair to say that paradigm in drug development has been for a number of years, and now we're starting to see the fruition of this. The realization that, of course, anti-VEGF treatment can really be successful in treatment of diseases like wet AMD and diabetic retinopathy. But the big hurdle has been universally the treatment burden. And that's because with these treatments, you need repeated injections basically for the rest of these patients' lives. And that has a real impact that translates into the fact that no matter how good the results are in a 1 or 2 year well-controlled studies with very frequent visits, we know that in the real world, and even in the controlled studies, once patients go into long-term follow-up, that patients aren't getting the treatment they need, and therefore they still have vision loss and even can go on to blinding complications and even blindness. So certainly these newer entrants into the market are in advance, but they really are incremental in the fact that at the end of the day, these patients are still going to need repeated injection for the rest of their lives. So what we're seeking to do is more than incremental and really a paradigm shift, since the opportunity of one-time treatment with gene therapy where you have sustained anti-VEGF activity instead of peak and trough levels with repeat injection is really the opportunity for the first time to have a one-time treatment where you can not only dramatically decrease treatment burden overall, but even in a majority of patients, our target is to actually prevent the need for any future injections. So in our trials with our investigators and also talking more broadly to the retina community, there's certainly an agreement that this is the ultimate direction and really a paradigm shift in how we might address this massive unmet need of treatment burden.
Got it. And while I understand that, this approach can benefit a huge number of patients, we also understand that it's not for everyone, right? So I wanted to ask what patient group or what is the patient profile do you think that will benefit most from 314?
So when thinking about this, there is the broad overarching value proposition of decreased treatment burden and therefore improve visual outcomes, which is ultimately what treating physicians and their patients hope to achieve by decreasing that treatment burden. There are some unique aspects depending on what disease setting you're speaking about. So, for example, with wet AMD, we have existing treatments that already are showing the issues with the frequent injections. And this leads to consideration of, well, the unmet need relates to comparison of how we can do versus existing treatment options and future treatment options. And in our lead program that's in pivotal, that's with subretinal injection. So as you said, given benefit risk and specific consideration of individual patients right in the treating physician's chair, there's going to be some patients and families that will want to proceed with a one-time treatment with subretinal delivery and others that may not. Probably the best answer is right from the words of our treating physicians, since they'll ultimately be making this assessment. And they certainly acknowledge this won't be for everyone, but upwards to 25% we've heard from thought leaders in this space, they consider this treatment for their patients. So still a pretty sizable part of a very large market, of course. And so an important opportunity that can really make a difference in that space. If you think of suprachoroidal delivery, so this is not only one time, but also in office. So we think if anything, that could potentially expand the proportion of patients that this type of treatment would be considered for. Having said that, that's much earlier in development. So we're looking at both, but certainly we in AbbVie are excited with the advancement of the ongoing pivotals for subretinal delivery to hit that significant market opportunity. On diabetic retinopathy, it's a little different and a little interesting to consider here, because we do know anti-VEGF treatment does work for treatment of diabetic retinopathy before patients even develop the blinding complications of diabetic retinopathy, such as diabetic macular edema and advanced proliferative disease. But in spite of that, and in spite of that being on label, physicians and their patients are simply not signing up for this because of the treatment burden again. And in this case, these patients, while they're at great risk of developing blinding complications, are still generally asymptomatic. So if you put yourself in the shoes of the patient or their family member who are in the clinic, the thought of going to intermittent treatment for the rest of a patient's life, as opposed to continuing to watch until a patient gets closer to these blinding eye conditions, there's really not a strong enough value proposition there. So not surprisingly, patients are not getting treated. So the unmet need and the binary nature of that are even more straightforward in diabetic retinopathy. As long as you have a one-time treatment and as long as you have an in-office approach. And that's why for diabetic retinopathy, we've advanced with AbbVie into clinical development with the suprachoroidal route for treatment of diabetic retinopathy to really advance here and potentially fill this very large unmet need, because right now patients are a slow-moving train wreck, frankly, of advancement to these complications. And the physician can show each patient the advancement of the disease from actual photographs of the back of their eyes, where you actually see the severity of the diabetic retinopathy advancing. And that's really what we want to stop the progression of with a one-time treatment, importantly.
Got it. That makes sense. So I wanted to jump into some clinical data next, and like to start with the AVIATE trial. Maybe if you could start things off by providing a brief overview of the trial and the summary of results that you've seen to date.
So AVIATE is an ongoing phase 2 study that's a dose escalation design given the phase 2 nature. And this in altitude, by the way, as I mentioned, are the first ever gene therapy treatments delivered to the suprachoroidal space. So that makes sense. We would do dose escalation in these first ever delivery approaches. And we've actually already completed dosing across 3 dose levels in previously treated wet AMD patients. And we've also reported interim data from these cohorts where we've shown stable visual acuity and retinal thickness while dramatically reducing injection burden, the whole point and the whole goal and the whole target of our approach. And we also just recently reported on the latest cohort at dose level 3, where we in AbbVie included a short course of topical steroid eye drops as one of the components of this expanded cohort. And we were excited to present these interim results, where we saw with topical eye drops, a short course, we had 0 cases of intraocular inflammation. So both from a safety and proof of concept standpoint, this is great for the program and a great opportunity to continue to follow these patients and really evaluate any potential dose response we may see across these 3 different dose levels.
Got it. And can you remind us the anti-VEGF retreatment criteria in those trials?
This is an interesting area, Daniil, where we have learned a lot from developing gene therapies in our subretinal program over the years for treatment of wet AMD. And a lot of it is what we anticipated, frankly, for example, from our phase 1/2 study, where we intentionally, since it was first in human study, had a very loose criteria for investigators to re-inject, where basically they could re-inject based on their own discretion, not only if there was worsening of disease in terms of visual acuity worsening and or disease activity, but even if there was no worsening and there was just any residual fluid or any concern at all, they could re-inject. After we completed the first in human study and saw proof of concept, we had the opportunity in the pivotals to use more standard objective criteria, which are very important for the pivotal studies and for consistency across sites. So in short, for subretinal, but also for the suprachoroidal program, we were able to be very consistent across these different programs to incorporate pretty standard criteria where you objectively base it on best corrected visual acuity worsening in terms of letters read on a typical eye exam chart that's used in clinical trials, and or a specific amount of subretinal thickness increase. And again, these are pretty standard with some nuances across the different gene therapy and even the extended durability non-gene therapy programs.
Okay, got it, understand. And you in the trial, you're also looking at the effect of neutralizing antibodies. I believe you have a couple of cohorts with and without those. Can you quickly comment on anything that you've seen in terms of how it relates to efficacy or safety?
Sure, and this actually applies to both AV8 and Altitude, given, as I mentioned, the fact that these are the first ever studies evaluating this route of administration for gene therapy. We felt it was important to methodically characterize what we see in terms of safety and efficacy based on patients' baseline AAV8 neutralizing antibody status, since we know with subretinal delivery that's not been an issue with other programs and continues to not be an issue in our ongoing programs because of the relative immune privilege status of the subretinal space. We chose suprachoroidal as opposed to intravitreal for our in-office approach because while it's a new route of administration, it shares some very important aspects to subretinal. Probably most critically that it's delivered into a compartmentalized space, the suprachoroidal space. So that does two things. That should increase efficacy because you're delivering very close to the target tissue, the retina, and it should improve, and this is also what we've seen to date, safety, and particularly as it concerns intraocular inflammation and some of the other downstream concerning safety issues that have dogged the intravitreal delivery route, both as observed preclinically and unfortunately in the clinical space. So with that said, there's still the need to evaluate certain aspects like whether pre-existing neutralizing antibodies matter or don't matter. So that's why we did include stratification of cohorts based on pre-existing neutralizing antibody or NAB status to AAV8. And fortunately, to date, in both AV8 and Altitude, we've seen that NABs haven't mattered. That is, both from a safety and efficacy standpoint, we're seeing the same basic results in both treatment settings. So that's really given us the opportunity as we think of expansion in these studies and future development to really allow all comers in terms of previous immune status in terms of neutralizing antibodies.
Okay, got it. Understand. And as you've mentioned, the study has been expanded to enroll an additional cohort, I think cohort 6. It's a dose level 3, the higher dose, with the short course of prophylactic steroids. You presented some interim safety data just recently. And as you said, we didn't see any intraocular inflammation, side effects, or anything of major concern. There was one adverse event of episcleritis that seemed a little frequent. Can you comment on that and whether you think it presents a safety concern?
Sure. So as you mentioned, we've seen a minority of patients with suprachoroidal delivery that develop transient episcleritis. So first off, what is episcleritis? So this is a redness that you can see on slit lamp examination that's done at any ophthalmic examination, where you see this redness on top of the sclera, so close to the surface of the eye, basically on top of the white part of the eye. And a couple important aspects of this is not inside the eye. So in other words, this is not a form of intraocular inflammation, which is really what the retina community cares about most, and really what is most important to report on, and that we and others in the retina community look at closely. And the other, I think, key aspect is, on top of not being IOI or intraocular inflammation, is, well, how do these patients respond, and how does this surface redness respond to non-invasive topical steroids? And the good news is it responds very well. So the episcleritis resolves in a matter of days to weeks with just short course topical steroids.
Got it. Understand. And I think there was another change in cohort 6 from the others, is that you also included an additional anti-VEGF run-in injections, one at week -4 and another at week 4. Can you clarify what the reason for adding those?
Yeah, it is another case where, because of our long history of evaluating gene therapy in the subretinal space, we've seen a lot of data in that setting of how patients respond and other considerations to think about in terms of delivery. And we felt here that in suprachoroidal delivery, already in the phase 2 setting, it was important to incorporate some of the things that we've done in the subretinal delivery approach. So for example, we use run-in injection and also a top-off injection after gene therapy delivery. And so in phase 2 of suprachoroidal delivery, we felt we'd reached a time in the advancement of the phase 2 study to start more mirroring what would ultimately be the design that we would use in pivotal. And that includes the aspect of run-in injection approach, which certainly would be a part of a pivotal approach. And the main reason for this is you don't want patients coming in with very uncontrolled disease, because that's just inherently going to be tougher to treat, even if you were doing a repeated non-gene therapy type treatment approach. You want to get the patients at least reasonably well controlled before you administer a treatment. So the main benefit of this is going to more closely mirror our pivotal, and we think directionally we should have better results, not worse, by adding an initial top-off on top of the screening anti-VEGF injection.
Okay, got it. I think it's, I guess, in a way similar to some other trials in non-gene therapy space of getting patients under control by using multiple loading doses before dosing with theirs. But okay, that makes sense. And I guess another question about the steroid prophylaxis, and the answer is probably no, but wanted to ask if that approach has any read-through to the ongoing pivotal studies.
Yeah, Daniil, your gut instinct there is exactly right, and that relates to the relative immune privilege status that we already know with the subretinal space. So we haven't seen any issues of or signs of immune-mediated inflammation in the subretinal space. So there would be no reason to adjust our thinking on that or our design or consideration of the basic characterization of subretinal delivery of RGX-314.
Got it. Makes sense. All right. And so you've dosed a number of patients today already. So I'm sure there's some feedback coming your way from both the eye care practitioners as well as some patients. Wanted to ask if you could share some of that feedback and maybe especially how it differs for those who've received subretinal versus suprachoroidal.
Yeah. In both cases, we've been very encouraged by the on-the-ground, so to speak, experience and response of our investigators. And this starts some years back from the phase 1/2 experience in subretinal with, let's say, roughly a dozen or two surgeons who delivered the treatment, and extending to the expansion of that into the pivotal, where now we've trained over 200 surgeons as part of the pivotal program, where we've seen it very scalable. So first, on the aspect of the investigators' experience and the feasibility of this approach, that's been very encouraging. We've seen that surgeons, not surprisingly, since their typical retina surgical cases are much tougher and more complicated than a very straightforward creation of a bleb in the retina, which they have experience doing for other specific indications. So that's already a nice learnings from advancing well into our pivotal trial. On the patient side, we've seen a very good response anecdotally, and that's also on subretinal as well as suprachoroidal. I'd say while suprachoroidal is certainly easier and doesn't involve patients going to the OR, since the OR experience is relatively short, and in fact, the procedure itself is a matter of minutes, the residual, even memory of that experience in terms of the overall value proposition certainly wanes pretty quickly relative to the real experience of, hey, I'm not needing as many injections. And in a majority of patients, I'm not needing any injections. So I think, not surprisingly, the feedback there has been very encouraging. And an interesting other way we can gauge this is another study we're doing, which is our fellow eye treatment study, where patients who've been in any of our subretinal studies so far have an opportunity to have their fellow eye treated if they meet the basic inclusion-exclusion criteria. So it's an opportunity for people to put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. So it's or walk the walk, let's say. So it's not only the anecdotal experience, but we'll have the opportunity to see whether that subset of patients where their fellow eye meets treatment criteria, we can actually see how many sign up for treatment of their fellow eye. But again, overall, we feel very good in terms of translation of the hypothesized value proposition and actually seeing that in our clinical trials.
Okay, makes sense. And so for AV8, I believe your next milestone is some data upcoming in January. Can you give us a brief run through of what we should be expecting?
Sure. So with the caveat that we're quite a few months out from getting to Hawaiian Eye, since that's the early mid January of next year, the opportunity exists there to continue to look at longer term follow-up, as well as or let's say comparison across different cohorts, including the most recent cohorts that we've dosed. Actual selection of specifically what will include, and you've heard this before, Daniil, really depends on what kind of time of data cut we can achieve ahead of the conference, and in these dynamic ongoing studies, how much of the data is actually in. And then on top of that, with our partner evaluating and going through the typical governance processes for our smaller company and of course the much bigger partner AbbVie, where governance flow can take a little time. So for that reason, we tend not to get too specific on guidance, particularly for too far out data cuts and presentations. But I think you can get a general flavor of the types of things we're excited to evaluate disclosing at that conference.
Yeah, that's fair. And in terms of the phase 3 program, do you have any updates to report since the last reported news that you shared previously?
I think the most impactful aspect has been the expansion of the program, including going global, as I mentioned before, which we announced earlier in the year. And I think another point to bring forward here beyond the global nature is the opportunity, and why we actually proceeded with this is the ability to look at some key secondary endpoints, predominantly around measuring effect on treatment burden in terms of not just patients who no longer need any injections, but also different levels of reduction of treatment burden that would be considered clinically important to a patient and a treating clinician. And the reason that's important to us and our global partner is particularly ex-US and particularly Europe, where a lot of these considerations and a lot of the actual data that you generate from phase 3 are important from a demonstration of the value proposition that play into pricing considerations. So I think that's the most critical advancement that we've seen. I think the other is we've seen very good recruitment, where we've gotten over half the patients that have been recruited. And I think that also speaks to the value proposition, in that clinicians and their patients actually see that value proposition of a one-time treatment and are therefore signing up for inclusion in the studies actually, in terms of both pivotal program studies.
Got it. Understand. And I want to spend the last few minutes on the diabetic retinopathy program, the ongoing phase 2 altitude study. So you recently reported some interim safety data from that program as well. And as we know, that study also had a prophylactic steroid regimen added to it. Does this regimen differ in any way from the wet AMD study?
So no, in terms of comparison to the wet AMD AVIATE study, proportion or half of the patients in the cohort who received topical, so non-invasive short course eye drops, steroid eye drops for the prophylaxis regimen, in altitude, all of the patients received topical eye drops of steroid. That was relatively short course, basically a 7-week taper regimen, which is much shorter than the eye drop cohorts in other gene therapy programs evaluating wet AMD or other indications. And basically we saw exactly what we saw in the AVIATE steroid eye drop subset of patients. So across both studies, with steroid prophylaxis short course again, we saw 0 cases of intraocular inflammation. So that's ultimately what AbbVie and we want to see. So I think not only the proof of concept that we've seen to date, but also even up to dose level 3 with prophylactic topical steroids, we're not seeing intraocular inflammation. So I think these are both good signs for the program and have us excited about showing more data as we go into the second half of the year, where we announced that we will be presenting another cut of data from Altitude at AAO later this year.
Got it. As you mentioned earlier, and as we know, the diabetic retinopathy patients are very resistant to anti-VEGF treatment, even though it's been shown to be successful just because of the treatment burden. What have you been hearing from the patients? How would they be open, or what is your confidence level that they would be open to receiving one-time therapy?
We hypothesize, and we're again seeing in actual practice, both from the investigators and the patients, with very good and rapid enrollment as we've gone up on dose and now added short course prophylactic steroids, a clear evidence that patients very much like this opportunity in a way that's very different than what we described earlier, where if the proposition is, I'm going to start injecting into your eye, and we're going to need to keep injecting thereafter indefinitely, and maybe for the rest of your life, to prevent progression, even though right now you're asymptomatic, that isn't really something that the vast majority of patients are signing up for. And we've seen that even with a couple label expansions that include that opportunity. Yet the patients and their clinicians are very worried about the future status of these patients, where, for example, severe NPDR patients have a 50% chance of progressing to vision-threatening complications such as proliferative diabetic retinopathy, even within a year. So though they won't sign up for repeated injections indefinitely, if there's an opportunity for an in-office one-time treatment, that really is the paradigm shift that we're seeing is translating into rapid enrollment in this study.
Got it. Okay. And I see that we're coming up on time, but I wanted to end this with the more big picture type of question. In terms of the ophthalmology programs at REGENXBIO, what do you think the investors are missing most about the value proposition and the differentiation of your programs?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I guess as a caveat, there's a lot of conjecture on this, or subjective feeling that one can have from this, but I think there's certainly some objectivity that we can bring to where we see value, and where, importantly, the treating clinicians see value, that we think, putting a positive spin on your question, we think as more and more data is accumulated, not just within our retina programs, by the way, but also in our non-ophthalmic programs, with our platform, there's going to be greater and greater recognition of various aspects that are positive for our platform. One is something that a lot of people don't think about, but that becomes more and more important as you get closer to potential approval and commercialization, is CMC and manufacturing. So this has been something we've cared about for some time, and it's allowed us to have great end-to-end manufacturing capabilities including suspension-based bioreactor process that we use across all our programs, not just the retina program, but also our non-ophthalmic phase 2 and phase 3 programs, that we have the capability to go up to 2K liter capacity. And we control our fate in that respect because we produced our own manufacturing facility, GMP production capability that we are using across our different programs. The maybe more visible aspect that we believe is going to become more and more clear, including later this year when we present more data on the retina program and the Duchenne program that we have, RGX-202, is the differentiation that our NAV platform vectors have in terms of clinical validation compared to any other AAVs that exist. And that's on any metric that you want to choose in terms of programs that have shown safety and proof of concept, where we not only see the first ever gene therapy in vivo systemic product, Zolgensma, for treatment of spinal muscular atrophy, is based on a NAV technology platform vector, AAV9. Also, the other metric we could look at is actual number of patients treated. So not only in both clinical trials, but even more commercially, Zolgensma. And even in our own program, we've treated well over 500 patients with RGX-314. And I think lastly, and here, this is really the kicker, I think, when thinking of both safety and efficacy, is durability. So because we've been at this a while, as have our licensees, we have real proof of durability of expression and effect. And a great example in a different therapeutic area is AAV8, so the same vector-based approach, delivery of clotting factor transgene in hemophilia, where we now have over a dozen years experience in hemophilia patients where we have confirmation of continued expression of the targeted protein clotting factor. So I think all these metrics are examples of clinical validation that are true differentiators that we expect to become more and more recognized the more data that we show across our programs.
Got it. Got it. Thank you very much, Steve. That's a very thorough, helpful answer. And we are out of time now. But again, thank you for joining and being a part of our ophthalmology summit. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniil.